The API server is an installed application that allows you to build REST, OData, and JSON APIs for many different data sources, including RDBMS, NoSQL, Big Data, flat files, and other sources. In this video, you'll learn how to configure the CData API server, create a simple API for a database, and use that API to access data. The APIs created with the API server can be consumed from web applications, mobile applications, and custom applications. They can also be used in the BI, ETL, and reporting tools that you already use. The API server can be installed in any environment, on-premise or hosted, and is available as Amazon, Azure, and Oracle Marketplace virtual machines. Once you have installed the API server, you can explore the server options. In Windows, to do so, find the API server icon in the system tray. Right-click and select Server Options. There are several tabs that allow you to configure the API server. The Service tab allows you to choose whether or not to run the API server as a Windows service and includes logging information about the API server. The Web Server tab allows you to configure connectivity to the API server, including the maximum number of connections and whether or not to enable plain text and TLS protocols. If you enable TLS protocols, you will need to assign a server certificate. If you browse for a certificate, you can choose a certificate from the available system stores. The Cloud Gateway tab allows you to enable the Cloud Gateway, which is a reverse SSH tunnel from a hosted SSH server to the API server. Simply configure the host, port, username, password, and certificate for the external server to allow external access to the API server through SSH. The Other tab allows you to configure logging for the API server, including the depth of logging, where the logs are stored, how often to rotate log files, and how long log files are allowed to persist on disk. To exit the API server, click on Exit. Once you've configured the settings, you can start the API server and navigate to the API server in your web browser. After logging in, you will see several pages. The first page is the status page. On it, you'll find the information about the number of connections, resources, actions, and users for the API server, along with the successful and failed requests. The settings page is where you'll configure connectivity to the API server, from connections to data sources and specific resources exposed by the API server to users with different permissions to connect to and work with the APIs. The Users tab allows you to create new users. First, create an admin level user with full read and write permissions. You can see the auth token that will be needed to authenticate. Next, create a user that only has permission to read data from the API server. With both users configured, you're ready to configure a connection to a data source. Navigate to the Connections tab and select Add Connection. By default, the API server can connect to several RDBMS, SAS, and Big Data, and NoSQL sources. For this video, you'll create a connection to the SQL Server database. Select SQL Server and configure the connection, naming the connection and providing the server address. In this instance, we use Windows Authentication to connect to the server. For all connections, you can choose either to use a property list or supply a raw connection string. Once the connection is configured, click Test Connection and then Save Changes. Now that you've created a connection, it will appear in the Connections tab. From here, you can edit a connection to update credentials or other connection properties, and even delete a connection that is no longer needed. With the connections created, you're ready to add resources. Resources represent the objects exposed in your API that can be queried, created, updated, and deleted. To create a new resource, click Add Resource, select a connection, and then choose a table exposed by the connection. For an individual resource, you can choose which columns to expose and which operations to enable for the connection. You can also rename the resource to ensure that your users know exactly which resources you're connecting to. Alternatively, you can select several objects at once to create multiple API endpoints with a few clicks and keystrokes. With the resources added, you're ready to move on to actions. Actions typically represent stored procedures for the data sources you're connecting to. In this case, there are none available. Next, navigate to the Server tab. Here you can edit server-specific configurations, including trusted IP addresses. The Server tab allows you to configure cross-origin resource sharing, which is needed if any client applications are hosted on a different domain from the API server. You can also configure which domains to allow, which methods to support, and more. The next section allows you to configure the OData protocol for the API server, including how paging is handled, the default format, and default OData version. And it allows you to modify the base URL used to connect to the API server. By default, any address is allowed to connect to the API server, but you can configure this as needed. Once you've completed your configurations, click Save Changes. The last page to look at is the API page. Here you see the API definitions for connecting to the API server and the exposed resources. The discovery endpoints allow you to dynamically discover the resources and their metadata. There's also an open API endpoint to allow connectivity from open API-enabled tools and servers. Under Resources, you will see a list of the resources exposed with documentation on reading from and writing to those resources. For testing, you can use an HTTP client like Postman to submit requests to the API. The data is returned as JSON, which is easily understood by many of the tools and applications you already use to work with your data. By exploring the API, you can see how to perform, create, update, and delete operations against any resource with those operations. With the API server configured, you are now ready to connect. If you have any questions, navigate back to the website, cdata.com/API server. For more information, or if you need further assistance, you can contact our support team by emailing support@cdata.com. Download a free trial of the API server and build instant APIs for your relational, big data, NoSQL, and SAS sources today.